Good morning, and welcome to part 2 of 4 of this video series, How I Composed Frostfell. So it was really cool to see all this awesome feedback from part 1. I had a lot of fun chatting about the composition, and I'm really excited also to chat about the orchestration here. So what I thought we would do today is I have a slightly different setup. I've got a stand in front of me, and I've got my girlfriend's iPad. She let me borrow it for this. And here we've got basically access to all of the full scores that I composed. So what we'll do is we'll look through just a handful of the pieces and use them as opportunities to talk about a few orchestration techniques that I used and maybe could be useful to you in your compositions. Many of these sketches, not all of them, but many of them started off actually as piano reductions. And the reason why I started those off is because in the beginning I wanted ideas to flow very quickly, and I didn't want to get hampered down with thinking about orchestral color too early. Sometimes it's better to work straight into score if you know specific colors that you want. Other times, if you just want these musical ideas to come out quickly, it might make sense for you to just write according to your instrument, which in my case is piano. So let's start off and look at A Boy and His Dog. It's the first really traditionally orchestral one that we've got. So this one did start off as a piano reduction. And you can sort of see it through the score. There's not an excess of color that's happening at any one time. It's relatively simple. Our roles essentially are that we have the string quartet for the most part playing this harmonic bed. So it's doing the bass and the harmonies, boom, chuck, chuck. And we also now have the piano and the winds kind of doing most of the melodic content, but not all. So in the beginning, we've got the whole string quartet playing pizzicato. And later in the piece, they're actually going to open up and play arco, which just kind of adds another level to them, adds another dynamic level without asking them necessarily to play louder. You'll also notice that there's this little slight interchange between violin 1 and 2 and viola kind of creating this bed. Violin 1 and viola are separated out by sixths. So these harmonies are moving down in sixths. And the viola is naturally going to sound a fifth lower than the violin because the viola has this extended bottom range to it. So you can think of it like violin 1 being like the soprano line, viola being an alto line, and cello being like a tenor line, or maybe even in this case, closer to a bass line. So the reason why we would choose viola as opposed to having two violins is simply because the registers are going to sound a little better. Just like if we asked two sopranos to sing a sixth apart, whereas if we asked an alto to sing the lower line, if it sits more properly in their register, they'll be able to sing it, number one, more confidently, but it'll also be in their sweet spot, and as a result, they'll be more balanced sounding. Now, to add a little extra interest to violin 2 and to give them something to do, I had a little interchange that happens every third measure here. So every third measure, the violin 2 echoes that little extra line. I would definitely recommend, as you're orchestrating, think not just about your piece, think about your players. Make sure your players would feel content with this and feel like they have something to do no matter what instrument they're on. We want them to feel like their role is valuable and warrant them being there, especially if you're paying them. So after this little introductory bed starts, we have flute and clarinet add in for some color, some doubling. They're simply doubling violin 1 and viola here. And then we have our first melodic instrument enter in, and it's the piano. Just one hand. I wanted to treat the piano in this piece not as the harmonic bed, which was assigned to the strings, but more as a melodic element. So our piano enters in here on its own, and the strings take it out and the winds cut. In this moment now, too, we have a little gap here. So you'll notice that there's a moment where the piano just holds a note. And whenever you have a moment when melody is sustained or dropped, it can be very nice to have something to come and fill its place. So you'll notice very subtly, I added a little bit more extra content in these two measures, just because it's a nice way to offset that space. So we have bum 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 ba-dum bum, just a slight subtle counter melody that comes in. Then moving right along, we have this little cute little flute line, all staccato, that just kind of adds a little bit of character to end the phrase. Then we have clarinet double in with the piano, so that adds an extra layer of interest and another voice to this melodic texture. Adding and subtracting layers is another equally effective way, if not more so, to add dynamic layers. So we consider that as we add instruments to a certain texture, whether it's a melody or a harmony, that can add extra dynamic layers, extra intensity, or just purely extra color. Now you'll notice the strings are starting to play arco. So to offset the extra intensity and color in the melody, we now open up the strings. So it feels like things kind of open up a little bit. And here, once again, as the melody note holds, we have a little counter melody, and we have this little echoing thing. I'm really proud of this, actually. Violin 1 plays this little legato, and then we have viola play it, and then we have cello take it. Bum, ba-dum, bum, dum, bum, boom, boom, boom. So a little echoing moment to go through it. Then as we move on, we have violin 1 take it on its own, and I thought this texture was really sweet. I was going for something that offset maybe the somberness of clarinet and piano, and Yo did an exceptional job with this. He played it exactly as I intended, which was very sweet, lots of, little portamento moments, heavy vibrato, just to add that kind of expressiveness to it. You notice also there's a little bit of a textural change here. So because violin 1 has now dropped out of the harmonic role and is taking the melody, we now have piano filling the more traditional space of boom, chuck, chuck. And we also have flute and clarinet taking some of this extra harmonic roles. So bum, 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 ba-dum, dum, ba, dum, ba-dum. Just little extra stuff to sort of break up the textures that are going on so that we don't just have purely string quartet doing harmony throughout. Then flute is going to take the line, and flute, again, these are all purely subjective choices as to what instrument would come next, but I felt that we could sweeten it up and sweeten it up and sweeten it up as we go. So we start off with a somber piano, then we sort of maybe brighten it a little with piano and clarinet, then we get sweeter with violin, and then we get sweetest with, a flute in its sing-songy kind of register. And the instruments that were playing previously, like violin 1, they now, you notice they drop out. Number 1, to give them some room to just breathe after having a soloistic line, but also just texturally, that if we have them very prevalent, we might want to have them jump into the background once they're done with their line. Then clarinet comes back in along with the piano just to offer the harmony against the melody. So all of the melodies so far have been purely single lines, and here I wanted to have them be harmonized in thirds. Then we hop on over, we go back to our pizzicato, if you notice, to sort of prepare the texture for the repeat that's coming. Many of the pieces in this album loop, and because of that, I needed to consider that I was going to end up in the same orchestral texture that I began the piece in. So everything is kind of does this sort of like arc. So we're starting to get closer and closer to the original texture here. After the flute and clarinets sort of end out, we have more of this gun 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 dun 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 dun, and we have some oddball harmonies here. Which I won't go too deep into. So there's a little bit of wrong noteness that happens in here deliberately. And we have this like kind of interchange in the piano. Blum, 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 blum. And once we end here, we end almost all on C. And the C's launch us right back into the beginning of the piece. So we're back where we started. So let's take a look at another piece now. I'm not going to spend as long on the other ones because we've established some of these basic ideas. The ideas of layering, the ideas of filling melodic space. Let's move on to Leaving Home. It's a very different kind of piece. Much more kind of free form with some of the orchestrations. There's still a lot of like melodic exchange, same basic elements, but less kind of like harmonics assigned to one, melody assigned to another. So let's just purely look at the melodic exchanges first. So we start off with the flute, and these choices were very deliberate according to what kind of mood I wanted at any given time. I wanted the beginning to feel very warm, and I have different associations with different instruments. So I think of flute as kind of innocent sounding, which is why I started with it. I want it to feel very innocent in the beginning. Then we have this moment where we have this exchange to the clarinet, which I think clarinet tends for me to sound a bit melancholic and also warm and homey. You'll also notice that to have the lines move seamlessly, flute and clarinet have a lot in common tonally, but to really make them blend as the line changes, I have the clarinet take up the note that the flute ends on. We call that dovetailing, and that's just simply a way to kind of glue these two lines together. You could think of it like orchestral crossfading in a way. After the clarinet plays, we have piano play solo, so we have everybody drop out for a second, or at least fade out. Then we have a pretty big color change and a little slight key change. So cello takes the line here and is accompanied by one of my favorite textures in the piece. Basically these trills or tremolos that are happening in different registers in the strings. So these thirds, it's a very like kind of old school shimmery texture. And it sounds slightly different than having them just play tremolo. So I could have had them do like double stops and play these lines tremolo, but that texture tends to be a little bit gruffer, like a little bit more rough. whereas I found this to be a bit more like, yeah, just kind of like shimmery. Enjoy my sound effects. Then after the cello has this expressive solo line, we have it taken up by violin 1 and doubled by flute. So that's a very traditional kind of sound, violins and flutes, really just to poke it out and add a little bit extra push because we have a lot going on here now. Then here, accompanying the violin and the flute, we actually have clarinet popping in an octave below, just to really push that texture forward. Again, we have a lot going on here, as you can see, and I wanted to make sure that the melody would stick forward enough that you could hear it. And then after all this intense build-up, you can see everybody's playing different stuff. The content of what they're playing doesn't matter as much in this measure or two as the fact that everybody's playing something slightly different and they're all working their way up this big arpeggio. That helps just create this tension and this build-up. So I wanted a lack of clarity here. I wanted everything just to feel like a big shimmer and then a sudden cut. Then after all that's happened, we have pianissimo. They're playing harmonics. I really want it to be totally still, like a still frozen lake, really. And just these harmonic beds to accompany the piano that comes in here. And I believe when we actually recorded these, they were played somewhat differently. Some of these harmonics didn't translate very well. So that's something that I would recommend too. You know, don't box yourself into what you've notated. Make sure you communicate with the players and say, is this the best way to accomplish what I'm looking for? Players know so much more about their instruments oftentimes than some of the composers do. Not always, but generally in the beginning. And I always rely on my players to tell me if I'm doing something the right way or the wrong way, unless I'm really convinced that this is what I want. Also work with players that you trust. You don't want to necessarily work with a player who's just gonna turn their nose up at you because you're doing something different. Okay, let's take a look at one more piece now. There's obviously a bunch of pieces here that are orchestral, but I wanted to focus on three that are probably the most varied from each other. So let's take a look at Showdown here. Showdown was probably the most difficult in every aspect, both the composition, the orchestration, and the mix for sure. We'll talk about that in the next part. No, we'll talk about that in the last part. So this initial idea here, I had a very solid idea of what I wanted. Bum, 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 bum. That was simply the pattern that I wanted, and I had to decide how to divide it up in the instruments. So again, I decided to use the string quartet because the quartet has a very uniform sound. Of course, flute and clarinet are very similar tonally as well, but I wanted to save their roles in this case until the very end. I wanted them to sing that melody out later. So the way I accomplished this was simply exchanging lines between the strings. We have a Bartok pizz here. If you notice that symbol in the cello, you can do certain kind of pizzicato effects like that in a number of different ways. You could use your nail on the string, or you could pull the string so hard that it snaps back. This is what I asked the cellist to do here, and it creates this percussive snappy effect. Now I wanted it to jump immediately from that aggressive texture into this quiet texture. On that point, I would say sometimes intensity doesn't necessarily mean loud dynamics. You can have things be very intense and very quiet, depending on how you introduce them. Hey, let me tell you about this story, that sort of thing. So it suddenly draws you in, and now I keep it quiet until I bring it back up to that point again. So again, we have some dovetailing going on here. Instead of just asking one instrument to play bum, 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 I wanted to exchange it a little bit. So this texture goes on for quite a bit until we jump over here. Now you'll see things are a bit more modular again. Everything in this piece was a bit more modular. We've exchanged that bum, 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 bum over to the piano, that as it was originally written in the reduction. And all these instruments here are essentially just adding little color in between. So I wanted things to just feel busy and frantic. So what we have is a bit of spiccato stuff in the viola. Viola makes a really good kind of like rhythmic driving element. So he's playing cello is playing bum 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 bum. And we have violin 1 and 2 generally acting as a unit here. Bum 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 bum. Now after this texture goes on, we have this kind of swarmy, this reminded me of like bees swarming. Once that happens, we jump over to this pizzicato ostinato here. Blum, 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 blum. Yeah, and now we're in 4/4, so that sort of breaks up all that chaotic rhythmic stuff going on. As this goes on, we're layering and layering and layering. So initially it's just violin 1. Then we add in violin 2 and the cello, so they're playing now in fifths and an octave. We have violin 1 switch over to arco, so again, that sort of thing of like pizzicato to arco creates an extra dynamic layer up. And we have the piano kind of hit this bass line just to set it up. and then hit another one in octaves. Cello takes it in octaves as well, and then a big snap on the and then we go over to this little part. Now, if you notice here, there's a little moment where I snuck in the prophecy theme, super subtle. Boom, bum, 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 bum. Just to kind of nod to anybody who didn't pick up that the ostinato itself was the prophecy. If you're paying attention to the themes and you didn't notice it before, you might have noticed it there. Then we finally have the winds enter in here to add to this texture. So this was really, really tricky to orchestrate and figure out for me. Mostly because I wanted to have an exchange that was happening back and forth, and I wasn't exactly sure how to do it. So it took a lot of time to figure out. But what I finally figured out was the best way to do this. Piano is kind of doing pretty traditional stuff, so it's doing the bass mostly, and it's doing the melodic content. In the strings, we have violin 1 and cello playing 2 octaves apart here, playing the melody. They do that for 4 measures. Then you'll notice we have violin 1 continues to play, the viola picks it up. And that's just again for a little bit of textural change, and that happens again later. Now, if we look at what the other instruments are doing, we have a 3-part voicing that's going on between violin 2 and viola in this open voicing, boom, boom, boom. So that fills in the space that's going on melodically. Then, if you look at the flute and the clarinet, they're actually taking up the notes that are not taken up by violin 2 and viola. So you have viola's taking boom, boom, B flat, F. Then you have clarinet, boom, violin 2, and then flute, doo. So it's this big 5-part voicing that's taken up by those instruments. And this is where reductions are really helpful, because this was really hard to figure out without having done a reduction. Had I really determined what I wanted earlier, it would have made this orchestration a lot easier for me. So these exchanges happen for a while, and we have little moments where they all pop in unison, and that adds some real intensity. They're playing these little tremolo moments. They're indicated as tremolo, but really it's just a shorthand way of indicating that they're 16th notes. Then at the very end of this whole thing, we have flute and clarinet finally come in with the melody along with violin 1 and 2. Just for a big moment of climax. We have trills in the winds, we have tremolos in the violin 1 and 2, and with the viola, cello, and the piano, we have bum 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 bum, all staccato, just adding this extra intensity, building up to the moment that we go all the way back and have that Bartok Pits and start over. So that's a lot to chat about, even just in those 3 pieces. Orchestration, I will say, was not one of my natural strong suits as a musician. I have done a lot of studying, personal studying, score studying, and just a lot of practice to try to get to the point that I am at now. I certainly have a lot of room to grow, but I wanted to try and create a box that was manageable for me with this album, so that I wasn't working with full orchestra, but rather with a handful of musicians that I know and trust in an environment where I can experiment and learn through the process of doing this as well. If you're starting off as an orchestrator, start small. Don't go full orchestra. Don't go full orchestra. Don't go full orchestra. It's not gonna benefit you. You'll benefit much more from trying to work with a small group of players, create interesting things, than you will trying to work with a 200-piece orchestra and choir. Work in the boxes that are comfortable for you in the beginning, experiment, learn your style, learn things that work for each instrument, and work with real players so that you can understand what works best. That's gonna wrap it up for the orchestration part. Hope you enjoyed it. I know it's a different format. And if you wanna see more stuff like this in the future, do let me know, because I like chatting about orchestration. I think it's really interesting. And maybe we could look through another piece that's not mine sometime in the future. I will see you in part 3, where we talk briefly about the recording process.